This story starts far from the holiday cheer. In third grade, now 17-year-old Brockton Harris was standing on the playground at school watching his classmates play tag.
So he sees all these kids running from this smaller kid, and
no, it was these bigger kids
you
running
explain it.
At a
oh, they were
smaller
running
kid.
at the small kid?
Yeah, like chasing the smaller kid.
Okay, so these big kids are chasing small kids, then what?
So then I started chasing them and yelling at them, and ended up sending one of them to the nurse's office for some reason or another.
You sent 5 of them to the nurse's office.
5 what? Like, these are kids that were like 2 or 3 years older at
They
least.
were probably 5th graders and you were in 3rd grade.
And he had beaten up all of them. And it wasn't the first time he'd acted out in a violent way.
He'd always been a busy, destructive, hard to manage kid.
But Brockton was not and is not a delinquent. Like a lot of kids who act out, there was something else going on.
I'm like, there's more to the picture than just behavior. You know, he would line things up. He'd take his toys and line them up in the room. Had to have things in an exact certain way.
At age 3, doctors diagnosed Brockton with Asperger's syndrome, now known as high-functioning autism. What Brockton saw on the playground that day in 3rd grade looked very different from what other kids saw.
And I have been studying it for the last 7 or 8 years.
Ina Fishman is a neuropsychologist in San Diego State's Department of Psychology, and her recent work helps to paint a picture of what was going on in Brockton's head that day. To get her findings, Fishman and her colleagues scanned the brains of 105 7 to 17-year-olds, about half with autism and half with typically developing brains.
And we wanted to understand how different brain regions communicate with each other.
They paid special attention to the amygdala,
Which is this deep-seated region in the brain that is responsible for marking whether the incoming information is critical or salient, whether it's a friendly face or a piece of music that I just hear. Amygdala kind of serves as a filter for marking, literally marking for the brain, okay, this is important, I better pay attention to it.
For those with autism,
This region in the brain had weaker connections, so it was communicating less with the regions in the back of the brain that are responsible for visually detecting facial cues, facial smiles, facial expressions, eye gaze, things that are really important for social communication, which happens to be an area of weakness in kids on the spectrum.
So when Brockton sees these kids playing tag, he's not looking for smiles or grimaces.
No, it was these bigger kids running
Explain it.
at a
Oh, they were
smaller
running
kid.
at the small
All he
Yeah,
sees
like
is a
chasing
kid
the smaller
about to be
kid.
bullied, not tagged. And he goes after them
So then I started chasing them and yelling at them
and doesn't stop. Fishman's findings offer some context here too.
During adolescence, the connections between amygdala that I just described to you and the prefrontal cortex, which really governs our behavior, strengthen dramatically during adolescence in neurotypical development. And we were really surprised to find that this strengthening of connections was completely absent in teens on the spectrum. And it was even reversed in the left hemisphere.
Fishman describes the prefrontal cortex as the brain's brake system. Teens with autism don't appear to be pumping the brakes as often as they should.
We always would say he doesn't have any brakes. That's just something that my sister and I and my husband have said for a long time.
While autism is a lifelong disorder, these weak circuits can be improved through practice. And Mom Chantel says Brockton has come a long way from that day on the playground.
And occasionally I will ride this to school.
He still needs some reminding, but most of Brockton's rewiring these days is done on old electronics and his scooter. Brockton hopes to become a mechanical engineer. Megan Burks, KPBS News.